Okay, we'll start. Okay, so as I see everybody taking some break from your final exam mode or pre-final exam mode, it's great to see so many people out here because we have a pretty special speaker today to sort of do the season finale of our pretty successful physics colloquium this semester. Is Professor Robert Hazen from the Carnegie Institute. He's a scientist there, staff scientist there. He's also a professor of earth sciences at the George Mason University. Now, he's had a very distinguished career and very unique in the sense that his work, both experimental and more recently theoretical, has covered many different disciplines. I say many, and I can tell you how I first heard about him or met him. Never in person, but I did actually have a paper as a student collaborated with him. He's forgotten from years ago. But his beginnings were, let me just go back and say he did his bachelor's and master's at MIT. He did his PhD at Harvard, and then he did his postdoc, a NATO postdoc in Cambridge. So he's really well traveled, and he's been sort of all over the place. He's still moving around. In fact, we're very lucky that he's able to catch him between events, and he's dropping in today and walking around like a field geophysicist and geologists and just going to places, meeting people and sharing his ideas. And we had some great discussions with him on many topics. So he's known as a mineralogist, but he's also made contributions in astrobiophysics. Think about that. And his more recent interests have been in, the interaction between AI or machine learning and the discovery of new materials. Now, he is the author of, he's hundreds of papers, okay? You can look at his bio. What I'm impressed by, he's authored 25 books, and this covers a wide area, including even pedagogy. The book I remember the best is a 1993 book called The New Alchemist. It's about materials under high pressure, which some of us in condensed matter are very interested in. And this is how I first got to know him. As a student, like early graduate school, I remember sending him some samples in my lab to these scientists, Professor Hazen and his collaborator, it was a Dr. Finger, where we were asking him to identify certain phases in a material we found that was superconducting. And within like a week or something, through X-ray diffraction, the expertise of deciphering, the fingerprints, he told us this is a new phase. You can count on it. And not only did we discover one phase of this copper oxide that was superconducting, we found like 12 of them. It wasn't earth-shaking because you didn't really raise TC, but still the ability to take the data and without telling them, what to look for, they can identify pretty unambiguously what the traces of the stuff out there. So this is the real science that you're talking about here. Someone who can empirically observe something, see the connections with other things, and draw bigger conclusions from them. So it's sort of both the observational details, care, and also the big picture vision. Okay, so now, he's written other books. Another one's on pedagogy you should check out. I won't go into that. And let me see. And today his talk is going to be on his newest book, Time's Second Arrow, which is currently going around discussing with people, promoting, defending, and still refining. And it's really fascinating because it challenges a lot of the more naive understandings of the idea of entropy and how things evolve. So it has to do with the co-evolution between materials and, say, the biosphere and the geosphere, so to speak. Now, what else can I say about him that's worth mentioning? Apart from his scientific endeavors, he's also a very accomplished trumpeter. And I say that he had, until recently, he 40-year career as a trumpeter, meaning it's a serious commitment. He had to retire from that. And he had performed with the Metropolitan Opera, the Bolshoi Ballet, and the Boston Symphony. Imagine that. So this is quite an achievement. Now you move to a different instrument, I believe, right? So anyway, if I didn't miss anything more important, there are many honors and awards. The one I think is very worth mentioning is that he was an outstanding faculty of Virginia, the state of Virginia, where George Mason is. So it means that he's also a tremendously good teacher and mentor. And one last thing before I give the stage to Professor Eisen is he has actually a material named after him. It's a biomaterial called the Hazenite. That's news to me. So let's welcome warmly Professor Robert Hazen.
Thank you, John. Thank for all of you for being here to listen to this rather unusual lecture, where I really want to address the question, what is time? What is this phenomena that we all experience as now? And now. and now. Now, physicists will tell us that there's an arrow of time associated with the increase in entropy of all systems in the universe. And of course, that's true. You buy a new pair of shoes, and in a few days, they're scuffed. You have a new car, it gets dinged. Our bodies, we get sick, we get injured. We're all going to grow old and die and decay. And that's a drumbeat of our existence. There's no escaping that. But I ask you, is that the only arrow of time that you experience? And I think what I want to demonstrate today is the answer is demonstrably no. That there also are aspects of our everyday world where we see just the opposite. We see an increase in order. We see an increase in information. Very, very soon, the flowers will come into bloom. The trees will come into leaf. We know that's true. We see our children. They're born. They grow. They learn. Science as an enterprise is constantly moving up this ladder of what we might call evolution. And so a group of us are proposing that this aspect of evolving systems, of complex systems, is a second arrow of time representing an increase of order and information. You know, for better or for worse, we can remember the past, but we can't remember the future. So that's this asymmetry I'm talking about. And I'm going to suggest this second arrow of time is tied to a quantity of kind of information called functional information. So that's where we're headed. I want to do four things. First, I want to look at evolution as a universal type of behavior of the cosmos. Abiotic, biotic, symbolic systems, social systems, all different kinds of systems show this increase in diversity and complexity through time. I'm going to suggest that there's no existing natural law that describes, explains, quantifies, and ultimately predicts the behavior of these evolving systems. For example, predicting the origin of life. We're going to look at this idea of complex systems as having lawful behavior based around this phenomenon called functional information. And finally, I want to look at ways to test this. And there are various ways that this new natural law are being tested right now. So let's start with a very simple evolving system. Go back all the way to the Big Bang almost 14 billion years ago in the formation of the very first atoms and isotopes. And we are told that there was a lot of hydrogen and deuterium, some helium, a little bit of lithium. So elements 1, 2, and 3, just a few of them. But these elements were able to form the first generation of stars. And when you form that first generation of stars, you have new nuclear processes, which get you up to iron and a little bit beyond that. Once you have those elements, you can start forming planets, and you can start forming a next generation of stars, which can go through what's called the early R process, rapid neutron process. It gets you more elements. The next generation of stars gives you virtually the complete table of the isotopes, which we can see as a plot of protons versus neutrons and about 300 stable isotopes, maybe a few thousand radioactive isotopes that have half-lives ranging up to many billions of years. And this is an evolving system. It increases in diversity and complexity, but it also does so stage by stage, each stage building on what came before. Darwin saw the exact same sort of thing in the evolution of life. And this idea is so deeply ingrained in biology now that there's individuals display variations of traits, that many more individuals are born that can possibly survive, and ultimately favorable traits are selected, passed on to the next generation. So Darwin talked about things, for example, like the evolution of the beak shapes of birds feeding on different kinds of food sources. And this became a classic idea of evolution by natural selection. I'm going to spend some time now talking about my own specialty, which is mineralogy, and the idea of mineral evolution. Because here again, we see a system that increases in diversity, and the distribution changes through time in a series of stages. Mineral evolution is the study of this increasing diversity as a result of physical, chemical, and ultimately biological processes. I have to tell you, just as a mineralogist, why I think mineralogy is an important field to think about in terms of evolution. First of all, minerals are the oldest objects you can hold in your hand. There are individual rocks that are 4.567 billion years old. They tell the stories of the evolving planets and moons. And each specimen, if you think about it, when you go to a museum, every single specimen is a time capsule. It's incredibly information rich, and it's able to tell the stories of this evolutionary process. Minerals are really important also to us. Virtually every material in this room, one way or another, came from our Earth. It came from the rocks and minerals, the soils. That leads to not only the raw materials of our various kinds of industries, but also agriculture, and every living thing is dependent on these minerals. Minerals are a driver of discovery. A Nobel Prize is awarded for the discovery of radioactivity, for the nature of the chemical bond, for high pressure behavior in materials. Of course, Mendeleev and the periodic table, the discovery of X-ray diffraction. These are all the results of mineralogical research, and they are just gorgeous objects. If you go to a museum and you see just the colors and the shapes and the sizes, they're quite remarkable. So this is what draws people like me into mineralogy. I'm going to be using a term of art called mineral species. It may sound a little strange to your ear, but it has a very formal definition. The International Mineralogical Association says a mineral is a naturally occurring solid that has an idealized chemical formula like SiO2 and an idealized crystal structure. And every unique combination of a formula and a structure is called a mineral species. And right now there are about 6,200 approved minerals, and about 100 new ones are discovered every year, even now. So those are mineral species. So mineral evolution looks at the diversity, their distribution, talks about the compositional ranges. That includes trace and minor elements, isotopes, also the grain sizes and shapes. All of these change systematically through time and tell the story of planets. We focus on the upper 3 kilometers of Earth's surface because that's where we can easily study this on Earth today. It's what we're likely to find on other planets and moons, and it's also where biology can directly interact with the crust. And it turns out biology is extremely important in this story. I have to defend, though, the use of the word evolution. Many people in biology in particular have objected to it. So you can't talk about minerals and evolution in the same sentence. But I completely disagree because mineralogy is one of many fields in which we can talk about change through time. And that's the most basic definition of evolution. But we mean something more. We also talk about complexification. That is, there's a sequence of minerals that gets more and more evolved, more species, more diversity, more elements involved, and also congruency. Each stage of mineralogy, as in any evolving system, builds, kind of ratchets up. You have to get to stage 3 before you can get to stage 4, and so forth. But it is not this. And I want you to erase this from your memory. It's not, the minerals have a different selection mechanism than Darwin talked about. Okay. So here's this key idea of mineral evolution. There's new combinations of chemical, physical, and biological processes that lead to new mineral species. And we talked about 10 stages of mineral evolution. If you want more details on this, there are a couple of papers, one from 2008 that originally proposed this idea, another that came out just a couple of years ago. These are both behind a paywall, so please just send me an email. I'd be happy to share these with you if you want more details about what I'm talking about right now. The very first stage, actually the 0th stage of mineral evolution, is long before our solar system, because stars form stardust. If you can imagine an old star where the atmosphere has silicon and oxygen, magnesium, nitrogen, other elements that form refractory phases, carbon forming diamond, for example. And as the star's envelopes of atmosphere expand and cool, these nano and micro phases crystallize out, about 25 different minerals in all. They use roughly 16 different chemical elements. And so you could say that the story of mineral evolution is actually how do you go from those original 25 stellar minerals with 16 elements to what we see today, over 6,200 minerals on Earth with 72 different essential elements. It goes through 10 stages. The earliest stage is nebular condensation. If you can imagine stardust in the early nebula through electrostatic forces collected together in these fluffy, they're stellar dust bunnies, if you will. And those dust bunnies, when the sun ignites, pulses of heat radiate out, the dust bunnies melt, they collapse into little droplets called chondrules, and these chondrite meteorites still fall to Earth today with about 100 different primary minerals. The chondrites come together to form larger and larger planetesimals. That causes melting. You get an iron nickel core of metal. You get a silicate mantle. you get thermal alteration, you get aqueous alteration, and you get impacts that cause new high pressure minerals, giving you about 300 minerals in all the meteorites that still fall to Earth. And that's sort of the baseline mineralogy of all the planets and moons. Now, we think that in a dry world, like the moon or maybe Mercury, this is about as far as you can get, 300 minerals or so. However, if you have a wet world, like Earth or early Mars, you can get many other minerals that are hydrated minerals, hydroxides, ices, clay minerals. This gets you up to 450. And our hypothesis is that's what Mars is like, that Mars got as far as this stage 3 mineralization. Now, Earth does some other things. When you have a layer of outer rock called basalt, and you melt it underneath, especially in a wet environment like Earth had, you get a partial melt that's much richer in silicon and aluminum, and therefore it's buoyant. It rises up and forms the continents with a rock called granite, and lots of associated minerals, including many rare minerals that concentrate in that early melt, incompatible elements, beryllium, lithium, boron, uranium, tantalum, other minerals forming elements, and you get about 1,000 minerals that are all in stage 4. Earth has even more fluid rock interactions because of plate tectonics. So millions of cubic kilometers of material in the upper crust and the mantle, the upper 100 kilometers or so of Earth's surface, they subducts down deep in Earth, partially melts again, new kinds of volcanism come up. You have all kinds of new ore deposits rich in sulfur and various metals, hundreds of new minerals forming here, new high pressure minerals formed during mountain building, and those are exhumed by erosion. And for the first time, these high pressure minerals come to the surface. And this gets you up to perhaps 3,500 different mineral species on Earth, the first stages of mineral evolution, all of which are just pure physical and chemical processing. But I've told you there are over 6,200 mineral species known today. So where do they come from? How do we get that additional mineral richness? And the answer, as you must have guessed, is life. This is an extraordinary finding that 20 years ago would have been considered not very likely, but it turns out a detailed analysis shows us this. And there's kind of an irony here because most researchers in the origin of life field now resort to minerals to play key roles. They're reactants, they're catalysts, they're templates, they're scaffolding. The surfaces protect delicate molecules in an aqueous environment. All of these factors play a role in the origin of life. But now, minerals playing the role in the origin of life, now life plays a critical role in the origin of minerals. And this is an aspect of the coevolution of the geosphere and the biosphere. Stage 6, the earliest age of microbes that made minerals. And in these cases, the microbes simply accelerated oxidation reduction reactions that would have occurred anyway at the surface, but did it much, much faster. So the microbes catalyzed these reactions and got the energy, the free energy from going from a more reduced to a more oxidized surface environment. These are these chemolithoautotropes, microbes that literally eat rocks for their energy. The game changer, though, was when life learned to create oxygen from water and CO2. Oxygen just being a byproduct of a gas, but when it went into the atmosphere, it caused a near-surface oxidation gradient that had not existed before. And essentially, the planet rusted. But it wasn't just iron. We can look at this great oxidation event on the horizontal scale here, going back about 4 billion years in time. Vertical scale is the amount of oxygen. You see that very dramatic rise, which is called the Great Oxidation Event. Probably occurred over a period of a few 100 million years, but that's a very short time for Earth. And it led to the largest iron deposits on Earth, huge formations that were formed because in the oceans, before this time, ferrous iron, Fe2+, the reduced form, is soluble in the oceans. But once that Fe2+ is oxidized to Fe3+, it's insoluble and sinks to the ocean floor, creating these vast deposits. But iron's not the only element. All the first row transition elements are redox sensitive. They can occur in more than one oxidation state, and therefore are sensitive to oxygen. Other metal elements as well. Also, the metals of life, Carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur are all redox sensitive, as are some other key elements, all of which are mineral forming and led to thousands and thousands of new minerals. I'm now going to give you some mineralogical eye candy. This is something that we mineralogists take great pride in, how beautiful the mineral world is. So these are some of the iron minerals that would not have formed before the GOE. The vast majority of copper minerals, those beautiful blue and green minerals, would not have formed before the Great Oxidation Event. So they're biologically mediated. Uranium minerals, 90% of the uranium minerals probably could not have formed before oxygen in the atmosphere. Nickel minerals, 2/3 of all of those. Just so beautiful. I just love this stuff. I really am particularly fond of cobalt minerals. Even though they're relatively rare, once again, most of the cobalt minerals are the result of oxygenation and many, many other elements and minerals, over 2,000 mineral species that we've identified that could not have formed without the Earth's atmosphere becoming oxygen rich. So this is stage 7. Now, stage 8 is a billion-year period where we don't think there are a lot of new mineral forming processes. It's because the oceans are deep and they were so full of ferrous iron that it took literally a billion years to titrate the oceans. You were buffered at the Fe2 plus, Fe3 plus boundary. Earth today at the surface, Fe3 plus is the stable form under almost all conditions. But back then, much lower atmospheric oxygen, because as soon as you made oxygen, it went into the oceans, and it took to do all the ocean from top to bottom about a billion years. Once that happened, then oxygen could rise and other atmospheric changes suddenly occurred, which caused wild fluctuations in climate, going from snowball Earth, where the principal mineral from the equator to the poles was probably ice. That's H2O in the ice crystal structure. So it is a mineral. And then periods when it got incredibly hot, hothouse Earth conditions, where ice may have gone completely extinct. And minerals can indeed go extinct, but then come back again when conditions are appropriate. And then finally, stage 10, Phanerozoic biomineralization. This is the time when life learned to make shells and teeth and bones, and also first went on to land, which caused radical changes to the mineralogy of the continents, because plants have roots that break down rocks, a huge production of clay minerals and other fine-grained minerals that wouldn't have existed before, all different sorts of things. So shells, teeth, bones, minerals associated with coal deposits, minerals associated with taphonomy, a little bit of hazelite there in the corner. You can ask me about that later. And this was an amazing time. And I just have to take a little break here and tell you the story about trilobite eyes, because to me, this epitomizes the co-evolution of the geosphere and biosphere. Each of those tiny eye facets in the trilobites, these are ancient arthropods that went extinct about 250 million years ago, but they were extremely abundant for 200 million years of Earth history. And each of those little lenses is a single crystal of the mineral calcite, calcium carbonate, CaCO3. Furthermore, it's a rhombohedral mineral. The C-axis is pointing right out at you from every one of those little lenses. That's pretty amazing to me. But there's a problem. Calcium carbonate is a terrible lens. Red light and blue light bend differently. It's called chromatic aberration. And so everything is blurry. Everything is out of focus. It wouldn't work. But if you analyze each of those tiny little lenses, it turns out they are zoned. The ratio of magnesium to calcium changes systematically from the center going radially outward. And that substitution of magnesium for calcium in just the right progression corrects for chromatic aberration. How can you possibly say that minerals don't evolve when you see the co-evolution of life and minerals? All right, some people say we're in stage 11. This is the Anthropocene epoch, some people say, and certainly we are creating a layer of mineral-like substances, some of them purposefully, magnets and silicon chips and laser crystals and so forth, that will persist for very long periods of time. Others inadvertently mind waste. We also move rocks around, creating xenoliths, as they'd be called, because they're in the wrong places. Our granite countertops in the middle of the city is a good example. So that's stage 11. And you can see the obvious conclusions of mineral evolution. I mean, we've got a huge diversification of mineralogy over 4.5 billion years. We see the sequence of mineral forming processes and, of course, the introduction of life as a very important part of the mineral evolution story. So what I hope I've convinced you here is that both abiotic systems and biotic systems do diversify, complexify in stages over time. We could also have talked about language evolution. We could talk about the evolution of science as an endeavor, music, all different kinds of symbolic and social systems as well. They all show this. So what we're going to claim now is that there's no natural law that describes, explains, quantifies, and predicts the behavior of these systems that are universally seen throughout the history of our cosmos. So, first of all, what do we mean by a missing law of nature? What could that possibly mean? First of all, we have to talk about the natural laws themselves. Every natural law describes a universal characteristic of our surroundings. And today I'm going to be talking about the macroscopic laws. These are the laws that we experience every day. So I'm not talking about quantum level behavior. I'm not talking about relativistic speeds or masses like black holes. So just the everyday experience we have. And so we're looking at how does a law explain and describe what we see? A missing law has to be completely consistent with the other laws. It can't contradict one of the other laws of nature that already has been well grounded, but it cannot follow inevitably, singly or in combination from the other laws of nature. It has to be something that's genuinely new, that is not described and explained by the other laws. So what are they? Laws of motion, laws of gravity, laws of electromagnetism, laws of thermodynamics. This group of about 10 statements collectively describes and explains almost everything we experience. And every one of these laws could not have been proposed until there was something which we call a conceptual equivalence. And let me go through them, because it's kind of fun to go back and remember what you learned many, many years ago. Isaac Newton. So he described the laws of motion, but he could not do this until he recognized that there are exactly two kinds of motion, something previous scholars had not known. Uniform motion is an object sitting still, like a cup on a table, or an object moving in a straight line at a constant velocity. Everything else is acceleration. And that includes an object going in a perfect circle at a constant speed because you're changing direction. Previous scholars called that uniform motion, but Newton said, no, that's acceleration because there's a change in uniform motion. Once he recognized that, these two kinds of motion, then he could propose that every change in motion requires a force. This defines the concept of force, that force equals mass times acceleration, which essentially defines the concept of mass. And then this extremely important equivalence that forces always act in pairs, allowing you to set up equations that you can calculate and therefore, for example, send a rocket like Artemis to orbit the moon and come back. That's Newton's laws of motion. Now, Newton also proposed the law of gravity, and once again, a conceptual equivalence. You could not possibly understand gravity until you recognize that when the apple falls from the tree, it's analogous, it's conceptually equivalent to the moon falling around the Earth in an orbit. It just has lateral motion as well as the falling motion. So Newton recognized that previous people thought there were two separate forces or two separate phenomena involved here. And because of that, he was able to come up with his equation for gravity and therefore describe, explain, quantify, and predict gravitational effects. In the case of electromagnetism, the answer is in the name. The conceptual equivalence is recognizing these two very different kinds of forces, static electricity and magnets, which seem so different on the surface. Actually, once you pass an electric current through a loop of wire and create an electromagnet, you see the equivalence. And once you understand that equivalence, you can basically ultimately have Maxwell's four equations. You can design electric motors and electric generators. But let me make an important point here. There are also laws of optics, but we do not include those in the list of these fundamental laws of nature because they are completely derivable from Maxwell's equations. You do not need any new statement in order to say how light breaks into prisms or how it refracts and so forth. So because they're tied into Maxwell's equations, those four equations are all you need to describe electricity and magnetism in our non-relativistic world. And then finally, the idea about energy. And this is the one that took the longest for the conceptual equivalence to come in, because energy itself is such an abstract concept. So the ability to do work, the ability to sort of force over a distance. Well, you have potential energy of different kinds, and then there's kinetic energy of different kinds. And then that incredible subtle idea that heat is also a form of energy. And until you had this conceptual equivalence, it was impossible for James Prescott Joule to imagine his experiment, the brilliant experiment where he showed how gravitational potential could be converted into the kinetic energy of a paddle wheel, which is then converted into the heat of that body of water. And Joule could show that energy changes from one form to another, but the total amount of energy is preserved, it's conserved. So that's the first law. And then finally, the second law, this idea that can be expressed many different ways. If you have a hot cup of coffee in a cooler room, eventually the coffee cup will come to the same temperature as the surrounding, never the opposite way. And that, of course, the increase in disorder that can be described various ways is the increase in entropy. And this is so far of those 10 statements I've given you that are the laws of nature, as we now put them in textbooks, is the only one that has an arrow of time. And that's this idea of the increase in entropy. A disordered system is the more probable system. And that's it. Those 10 statements I've just given you. And the question is, does that describe and explain, does it quantify and predict everything you experience around you in a macroscopic world, in an everyday world? And we say the answer is no, because none of these laws, individually or collectively, describes, explains, quantifies, and predicts the nature of evolving systems. For example, us sitting here with our conscious brains thinking about this question. You cannot derive that from those 10 statements, but it is a demonstrable part of our natural world. So this new law has to be consistent with all those previous laws, but it cannot follow from those laws. And so this is kind of the conclusion we came to 3 years ago when we began proposing this publicly. So now let me tell you about the law that we're proposing, the law of increasing functional information. This was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy in October of 2023. Since then, it's been downloaded a lot, and it's already been cited more than 200 times, and it's gotten a lot of notoriety in one way or another. But let me explain to you what we said. What happened is during COVID, a group of us had been thinking about this idea for many years, and we said, you know, it's really time to examine the literature on entropy, the literature on dissipation-driven evolution and so forth, and see if we can agree with them that entropy is all you need. So we had an amazing group. Stuart Bartlett's a theoretical physicist at Caltech. Mike Wong's an astrobiologist at Carnegie. Anirudh Prabhu is an information scientist. Carnegie. Jim Cleaves is a world-renowned origin of life chemist. Jonathan Lenine, a planetary scientist, and Heather Demarest and Carol Clellan are both philosophers of natural law at the University of Colorado Boulder. And they were really important in this effort because they made to us very clear what it is and what is not a natural law. And we met weekly by Zoom during COVID. We read vast amounts of literature and discussed them and went back and forth. And eventually we came to the conclusion that the existing literature did not satisfactorily describe evolving systems. So that's why we came up with the idea. And so here's this basic statement: a pervasive wonder in the natural world is evolving systems. We see them all around us all the time. Every one of these systems has a congruent set of stages where each stage increases what you might call colloquially the complexity of the system, what we're calling the functional information of the system. And the systems are conceptually equivalent. This is important in 3 ways. Just like any other natural law, you had to see the conceptual equivalence. All these systems have the potential to occur in vast numbers of different configurations because they're made of little particles, either protons and neutrons to make isotopes, atoms to make minerals, molecules to make cells, cells to make organisms, or you can think about letters and words to make language, and so forth and so on. All the systems have small bits that can be arranged in vast combinatorial numbers of possible configurations. There have to be processes, ongoing processes, that are generating new configurations. If you don't generate new configurations, you cannot evolve. So evolution is a bounded idea. It only occurs if these two things are true and if there's a mechanism to select some configurations in preference to other configurations. And we call that selection for function. We have to be very clear about what function means in this process. And what we've come up with is in natural systems, there seem to be three kinds of function. One is just static persistence. And it may seem almost like a sophistry, but if an object doesn't fall apart, if it doesn't melt, it doesn't evaporate, it doesn't transform to something else, so it's stable long enough, for example, a mineral is stable long enough that we can put it into a museum and put a label on it, then it has been selected versus all the configurations that do fall apart or that never assemble in the first place. A second possibility is dynamic persistence. This is true of a forest fire as long as it has fuel. It's true of a hurricane. It's true of star systems. It's true of our bodies. And here we're getting very close to some thermodynamic arguments about the persistence of these dynamic systems. And there's where some of the confusion has lied in the past, because of course, entropy is always increasing in these dynamic systems. You're always radiating energy into space as these systems operate. That's always going to be true. And then there's novelty generation, which is being widely recognized now as a key aspect of evolving systems. And this is where you go from one level of organization in minerals or in isotopes or in life to another. When you discover something new and suddenly your configuration space expands in a dramatic way. And it's a little hard to see this, but this is a schematic of this idea we call funneling. So this is a paper that just came out in the Royal Society Interface Focus. The idea is you start out with a fairly limited configuration landscape. Most configurations have low function, but the z-axis here represents increasing function, and that you explore this space and you get on places. And once you get on one of these, you just keep going up it. And sometimes that will lead you into what we call funneling into a new expanded landscape, because you can do something you couldn't do before. And that gives you new opportunity space, and that it has its own function landscape, and it goes up higher. And you can basically analyze all kinds of systems. I'll tell you a little bit about tumor evolution, which is one of the applications of this idea that we had not expected. So how do you measure something like evolution? And we're proposing to use the metric that was introduced in 2003 by Jack Szostak, Nobel Prize-winning biologist and origin of life chemist. He introduced this idea to talk about different genetic polymers, but Jack and I worked together in subsequent papers and in 2007 applied this to various kind of physical and symbolic systems as well. So it's a general idea. And what it says is basically, as you have a configuration landscape, you can imagine all the different possibilities of that landscape, but only a tiny fraction achieve a high level of function. That's those narrowing as you go up. And if you look at that fraction, that's the FE here. You just take the minus log to the base 2 of that, and that's the number of bits of information. Now, this is a really simplified version of an equation, which in practical reality is going to be much, much harder to apply. But this is the idea that we actually measure in many systems the number of possible configurations and the fraction of those that have a certain level of function. The idea is you select and you select more, you're just going to keep going up the ladder, a tinier and tinier fraction. This paper was published recently, and happy to share that with you. So here is our missing law, if you will. The functional information of a system will increase, that is, the system will evolve, if many different configurations of the system undergo selection for one or more functions. That's our proposed law. It is a second arrow of time. Because what we're saying is, in addition and in parallel to the inevitable, inexorable increase in entropy, under certain bounded conditions, if you select for a function, if you say certain configurations are preferred, you will, for that function, just keep ratcheting up. Now, anytime you build a new configuration, entropy increases. but only under special circumstances will selection give you a configuration that has increased information. So these two arrows both increase, but the entropy one is continuous. The increase in functional information is episodic. Only under certain circumstances will that happen. That's the bounded nature of the law. Okay, so that's the new law. That's the way we're proposing it, but has to be tested. And the only way this makes any sense is if we actually can do something practical with it or test the idea. So this is a paper that came out in PNAS Nexus about a year ago, in which we applied this to mineral evolution. Now, I've shown you the stages of mineral evolution. And the proposal then would be that the functional information of mineral systems, stage by stage, has to increase. That is, the fraction of minerals you see compared to the possibility space has to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And we did that calculation. Here you see dots that represent functional information on the vertical scale, the number of minerals that actually exist at that stage on the horizontal scale. And you say, well, if the number of minerals is increasing, shouldn't the functional information go down? Well, no, it turns out that if you do the combinations and permutations of the elements available to make minerals and of the structural complexity of those minerals, that even though the number of minerals is going up, the permutations and combinations of elements goes up orders of magnitude faster. But the other thing that's intriguing about this is that as you go from stage to stage, it doesn't continually increase at the same rate. You're approaching an asymptote. And this suggests to philosophers of science who think about evolving systems that mineralogy, although a very rich system, is a bounded system. So a bounded evolution means that you reach a limit and you really can't go much farther. And in spite of the fact that the combinatorics of 72 different chemical elements are huge, they're not infinite. A difference between this system and some estimates of living systems is that life may be an unbounded evolving system. It keeps creating larger and larger possibility space. And even here today, we're creating a larger possibility space by talking about it. So that's one idea that's out there. We've applied this very, very quickly because I don't want to go too long. We've been applying this to an idea about biosignature detection. This is a fundamental problem in astrobiology where we're looking for life on other worlds. If we find molecular fragments that have been highly degraded, how do we know whether they came from life or maybe from carbon-rich meteorites? The idea that we've proposed is that life's molecules are selected for very specific functions. So you make a lot of fewer things. And therefore, even when you fragment biomolecules, so there's only 2 or 3 carbon atoms connected anymore in those fragments, and you can go back billions of years, we suggest that there's going to be a fundamental difference between that and the carbon molecules you find in meteorites. And indeed, in these papers, which have just come out recently in PNAS, we've done that. We took lots of different samples of carbon-rich materials. We measured them using something called pyrolysis GCMS. Please ask me of details if you want to know. Each analysis represented by 500,000 numbers and using machine learning to compare. For example, here we see organics from meteorites on the left, organics from a microbe on the right. Think about facial recognition using machine learning. We're able to distinguish these. And here's a plot of just of the very first study we did with just 134 samples. All the abiotic things formed here on the first 2 principal components, representing about 55% of the variance of the system. Here we see the modern living things. And although we didn't train on living versus fossil, they're the fossil things. And this makes us very, very confident, not only that we're distinguishing living biotic versus abiotic molecular signatures, but you can also look at ancient molecular signatures and tease out biochemical information from them. What has surprised us the most? So those are tests that we've done and predictions we've made. There have now been dozens and dozens of papers coming out. Every week they're coming out now. Groups that we know nothing about, fields we know nothing about, that are taking our model and say, we've been waiting for something like this because Darwinian evolution doesn't fit what we see. There's now 6 papers published, including in Comprendu and some other journals about cancer evolution. The idea that tumor evolution, going through stages, is our funneling operation. because the tumor is not evolving by Darwinian processes. The tumor is exploring configuration space, trying to find new entry points to the body. And as it goes, for example, from stage 2 to stage 3, that's when the tumor learns to use the body's circulatory system and co-opt that. And then stage 3 to stage 4 is when the tumor learns to metastasize. Now, the past conventional wisdom is tumors evolve through a Darwinian process, which means that the therapies that are developed are using basically trying to stop the evolution in a specific way. The new therapies that are being proposed in these papers say, no, we have to basically prevent the funneling operations by changing the way the tumor reacts. It's a completely different set of therapies. I'm not an expert on this, but we're astonished to see that this paper is basically, our paper is cited in the abstract as the guide to a new way to treat cancer. It doesn't mean that we're right, but it's a fascinating application. And then paper after paper, here's a group from Georgia Tech that's doing chemical evolution leading to the origin of life. They put a complex mixture in a particular environment that's cycling wet, dry, hot, cold, and they see the chemistry staying here and then suddenly jumping up to a completely different set of chemical components and sitting at that state for some period of time, then jumping up to a completely different one. Exactly the same kind of funneling we predicted. Here's something on what are called this below ground microbiomes, which shift season to season. It's not a Darwinian process. This group claims that the way the microbiomes change is reflected in our selection for function ideas. Here's one that talks about advertising online and the success of companies in an internet environment. This one talks about the evolution of large language models and AI. There's a group at Google that's using our model to try to understand if AI will go through one of these funneling operations, perhaps doing something that we do not expect AI to do. People have talked about conscious or self-aware AI, but that's the kind of funneling that's difficult to predict in advance. And here's another medical thing which talks about Alzheimer's, saying that Alzheimer's, again, is not a Darwinian evolution, but rather it's a local selection for function in terms of the prions that are involved in this. So this is very exciting work. We don't know where it's going. It doesn't mean that we're right, but it means that the ideas are at least generating some interesting laws. So let me just quickly show you the summary that we see both abiotic and biotic systems evolve, that the law that we're proposing is consistent, completely consistent with the other laws, but it doesn't follow from them, and that this law implies that there's a second arrow of time. And so I come back to that original question, what is time? And it is absolutely true that we all experience the arrow of time of increasing entropy. And it's an integral part of our lives because we are getting older. We know we're going to die. And there's some things in our lives that are just irreversible. Every one of us in this room has said that thing to someone we love that we realize suddenly we shouldn't have said that. And you can never take it back because time is irreversible. But at the same time, people make choices. And yes, some people will choose chaos, they'll choose hate. We see that in the world all too much today. But we can imagine in our own minds configurations for our lives. We can imagine becoming scientists and advancing knowledge. We can imagine writing books, creating music. Because we can imagine these possibilities and choose. We have agency to make the choice to select for the function we think is important. And in a much more day-to-day way, just think about this. You have the agency. You can help others. You can choose to be kind. You can choose to love. And in a sense, you will be increasing the functional information of your world. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Wow. Edifying. Let's take some questions from the audience. Yeah.
How would you relate the evolution concept
I'm sorry, you'll have to speak up. There's a buzz here that's,
Give you the microphone.
yeah, I apologize. It's just a little hard to hear.
Someday we'll do this with a drone, but right now.
So how would you relate the concept of evolution with spontaneously symmetry breaking?
Oh, so spontaneous symmetry breaking. That is to be a new configuration. And then whether or not that symmetry breaking is preserved is a selection. So if the configuration that results is preserved and sustained, and especially if that configuration then leads to additional symmetry breaking, as we often see in the chirality of living systems, then that would be an example of this. And perhaps you could quantify it. I haven't really thought about that specific example, but certainly you create a local configuration. If it has some selective advantage, that configuration may persist long enough, at least to be an intermediate state to another symmetry broken state that's even more stable.
Good question, Peter. Getting my daily exercise. Okay.
So just wondering, the type of minerals, it does not include artificial minerals or artificial stuff like pure metal, for example, that doesn't exist, pure silicon. And then can one argue that the creation of these new material is part of evolution, and maybe human is just a way for rocks to make more rocks?
Yes, this has been discussed, and that's what I meant about the stage 11, the Anthropocene mineralogy. And we have not yet done a calculation saying, well, how many different inorganic crystalline compounds are there? How many different elements do they use? And what are the permutations and combinations? And in fact, does that extend that graph that I showed you? That's a really interesting question, but we just haven't done it. But we certainly agree that one could make that argument. And it's hard to say that humans are not part of this evolutionary trajectory, which is a continuum from the Big Bang till into the future.
Hi, thanks for nice talk. I was curious to understand a bit which is the relationship between functional information evolution and the evolution based on Darwin principle, please.
Yes.
Thank you.
And this is very important. The Darwinian ideas about evolution by natural selection is totally consistent. The three ideas that are baked into Darwin's are very analogous. There are many possible configurations. And Darwin says more individuals are born than can survive, so that you create lots of different configurations, and there's a selection mechanism. So Darwin is a special case, as are minerals, as are isotopes, as are language evolution. Each of these has its own configuration space, its own mechanism of creating new configurations, and its own mechanisms of selection. But they're all conceptually equivalent in that sense.
So my understanding of like what a natural law is something that like would have to be true in all circumstances. It cannot be violated in any case. And I have a rather dark example that I'm not sure how it would fit into that. If there was like, if an asteroid struck the Earth and smashed it, how would all the functional information of life on Earth and all our science and our language not be destroyed and thus would decrease?
It absolutely would. And that's because you have suddenly ceased creating new configurations. That is there's no more selection at that level. So if the environment changes radically, and this is something that's very true in life. Let me give you a simpler example. Just imagine a group of insects or fish that go into a cave that's totally dark. Over time, they'll lose their sight. They will no longer be able to see. That's because there's no more selection for the ability to see. And then it becomes actually more efficient. You don't use metabolic energy building eyes that you're not going to use. But in a sense, those fish, those insects become simpler. They no longer have a visual system, but it's because the environment has changed radically. So the selection pressure is completely different. So I know that may seem like special pleading but this is a bounded law. It only works if you have new configurations being generated and a selection pressure on those configurations within a particular environment. And as soon as just like entropy is going to change if you suddenly consider a completely different system. So I think it's consistent. Maybe there's a question from one of the students.
We have some online questions.
Yeah.
So here's the first one. Could you discuss some of the criticisms of functional information theory?
Yeah, there are a lot of criticisms of our ideas. Some of them come from evolutionary biologists who strongly feel that we shouldn't be using the term evolution to describe anything other than biological systems. I think that's a fairly easy one to deflect. There's some that come from physicists who have thought long and hard about this problem as we have, and have concluded that entropy drives all evolution. It isn't just that the configurations are stochastically arranged and there's selection, but they said that evolution facilitates the increase of entropy. And in the extreme case, Jeremy England would say that our brains evolved so that it more rapidly dissipates energy into space than the same molecules if they were just in the gas. So that's one very strong argument. Functional information itself is also criticized because in most systems, it's computationally undefined and arbitrary. What do you mean by the number of configurations of cells in a body? There's no mathematical way of defining that. And so then you have to use either approximations or very subjective boundaries on the configuration space of what you can imagine versus what's physically possible, what is physically actually has been explored. And that becomes so subjective that functional information is really difficult to use. So we think there probably is going to need to be a more complex formalism that we haven't figured out yet.
Yeah, thank you for the very interesting talk. I have a question related to that, which is when you were defining functional information, there were several causes of the functionality, or you might say aspects of functionality. I was wondering, do you know of examples where these aspects compete with each other and that some configurations might be more functional in some aspects, whereas a different configuration is more functional in others? And then also, does this mean that fundamentally there's a problem with having a well-defined functional information?
Yes, function is such a subjective idea. So there are a couple of examples of that. One is there are aspects in biology where a particular physical trait, for example, a wing, wings may have begun as being thermal regulators in dinosaurs, and then they became flight, and now in penguins, they're for swimming. And so this exaptation where you're changing the function is certainly part of that. There are some, also the question about at what level are you selecting? Imagine you have an organism where of course, the enzyme has to evolve to do a function, but that's part of an organelle in a cell, which is part of the cell, which is part of a multicellular organism, which is part of a community of species, say ants. And at what level are you selecting? Are you really selecting just for the enzyme? No, I mean, you've got to select at the level of the ants or the ant colony, but if the enzyme doesn't work, then the ants. So that's the thing where you have nested layers of function. And again, we think that there must be some fairly complicated mathematics that will describe that. And people have worked on that idea about nested feedback loops, but it's not clear how to apply our formalism. I think it is true, though, you can say that the relative functional information in the enzyme is smaller than the functional information in the cell, which is smaller than the functional information of the multicellular organism, which is smaller than the functional information of the body as a whole. And so whichever level you look at, you can look at relative functional information, but that's not a very satisfying answer. And I don't want to give you the impression that we've figured this out. This is a very subtle point.
Thank you so much for the colloquium, Professor. My question is that can technology advancements and scientific research also be counted as bounded evolution systems? And is it possible to use functional information to predict the future stages of, for example, mineral evolution and other evolution systems? Thank you.
Okay, there's two parts to this question. The second one is that these leaps, these funneling events, appear in most cases to be intrinsically unpredictable. That is, these are sudden radical changes that when you're in the one stage, it's very hard to imagine what the next stage is going to be. And then suddenly you find this opportunity space. So I think in terms of predicting future technologies, we may have some vague general ideas, but it may be very hard to do it. Whether technological and social systems are open-ended or not, there's actually a growing literature on this. Marc Bedeau is one of the philosophers of science who talks about open-ended evolution and ergodic systems. And ergodic system, the idea of whether you can actually, in the lifetime of a universe, sample all possibility space. A very simple example is if you have a protein that has 1,000 amino acids, that's 20 to the 1,000th power different combinations. And in the lifetime of the universe, with all the planets and all the time there is, you couldn't sample all those. So you're only, even in the lifetime of the universe, you're only sampling a small fraction of conceivable possibility space. And so then that leads to the question of whether something's open-ended or not. If you can't explore all space, it's effectively open-ended, even though it may not be mathematically infinite. Does that make any sense?
We'll take a question online again.
So question, your perspective of language building blocks, structure function, and evolution, does it explain the success of LLMs, large language models?
Okay, I'm not sure if I'm getting that question.
Yeah,
I was so sorry. Yes, and I have to say, I honestly am not an expert in LLM, large language models, and I'd have to defer that question to one of my colleagues. That you can imagine that this idea has led us down many, many avenues of research where we're simply not as familiar with the nature of evolution and selection in those systems, and so we have to defer to experts. If this idea has any validity at all, then experts in different fields will need to be able to say, oh, I see how your ideas map onto our field. So that's the most I can say about large language models. And I bet the person who's asking the question probably could answer the question better than me.
That's good. Okay, one final question from the audience.
My question is very similar to his question. As we know that living systems, we also obey this functional independence law, or the functional information law. And humans, we ourselves have evolved from single-cell organisms. So my question is AI the passageway leading to the next possible space, or AI itself is the new possibility configuration space?
Yeah, so what is the next big funneling event? Is it something that technologically we design, but then it takes off? And of course, so much science fiction is based on exactly that premise. I don't think we can rule it out. There are a group of scholars at Google Research that are using this and really trying to understand it. Whenever they look at artificial life programs, especially the very sophisticated ones that are now coming out of that Google group, what they see is the artificial life system exploring a kind of topology space. It is what's programmed into, but then suddenly they enter a new topological space that was not programmed. And they start doing new things, new behaviors of the A-life system, and then something else and something else. And they're using this as kind of training themselves how in silico systems may evolve in these funneling events that just simply are not predictable. They don't understand where these jumps are coming from, but they are clearly observable, and they're quite remarkable. If you look at the two-dimensional projections or three-dimensional projections of these A-life systems at Google, they're Blaise Aguero y Argos, who's the vice president of research at Google, is the leader of one of these groups, and his publications and the online stuff is just jaw-dropping. So we don't know. I think that's one of the great, we can predict that funneling events will happen, but you intrinsically can't predict what that next state will be because it's something new. It's novelty.
Great. So let's thank Professor Hazen again for this really fine talk. Thank you very much. And thank you all for attending. Look forward